This, by a wide margin, is the most definitive path by which Iran will not get a nuclear weapon.
Do you feel like you have to sell this deal somewhat?
I'm here to answer questions and explain what the deal is. I'm confident they'll like it when they understand it.
Selling the deal. This afternoon, President Obama pitching the landmark Iran nuke deal to Congress and the country as the Veep climbs Capitol Hill to keep Democrats on board. Hello, I'm Ty Hernandez in New York. Let's get right to ABC News Chief Global Affairs Correspondent Martha Raddatz, the only network news reporter inside Iran following this story. Martha?
Secretary of State John Kerry arrived back in the U.S. overnight after weeks of marathon negotiations ending with that historic deal. But it is clear his work is not over, despite the excitement about the agreement here in Tehran. Fervent reactions to the nuclear deal resonating around the world. On the streets of Tehran, those who suffered under sanctions for years danced overnight in celebration. But in Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was the deal's biggest critic, calling it a mistake of historic proportions.
The world is a much more dangerous place today than it was yesterday.
And back at home, House Speaker John Boehner spoke out vehemently against the deal, threatening to halt it.
It's going to hand a dangerous regime billions of dollars in sanctions relief while paving the way for a nuclear Iran. If, in fact, it's as bad a deal as I think it is at this moment, we'll do everything we can to stop it.
Now, House Speaker Boehner and Congress have 60 days to review the agreement and vote to accept or reject it. But President Obama has threatened to veto a congressional rejection, telling the New York Times,
This, by a wide margin, is the most definitive path by which Iran will not get a nuclear weapon.
And Secretary of State John Kerry argued that there is no great alternative to the deal.
The alternative is to, what, go to war immediately, bomb them, sanction them further? Well, wait, no, you can't sanction them further.
But President Obama acknowledged in his interview with the New York Times that some of the money that Iran receives from sanctions relief could be used to sponsor terrorism against its enemies in the region. The president saying we will have to systematically guard against that.
ABC's Martha Raddatz reporting for us from Tehran. And joining us now from Washington, ABC News Chief White House Correspondent Jonathan Karl and Senior National Correspondent Jim Avila. John, why is this landmark deal such a hard sell to Congress?
Well, Congress has been skeptical from the start. Many in Congress see Iran as the principal exporter of terrorism in the Middle East. They think this deal is too easy on Iran by allowing them to preserve the basic outlines of a nuclear program, kind of putting some of it perhaps on the shelf, but allowing it to further develop what it will need in the future to develop nuclear weapons. But I think the biggest issue facing this, reason why you see opposition in Congress, is that this deal includes a lifting after 5 years of the arms embargo on Iran. So members of Congress look at this and say the sanctions lifted mean Iran will have access to some $100 billion more in revenues, and they will be able to go legally and legitimately on the open global market for weapons within 5 years.
So Obama has a tough road ahead, Jim, but this is another high point for the Obama administration. Some saying he's had a great past 2 weeks.
I think it's pretty clear that President Obama is very happy with the way the last 2 weeks have gone. This Iran issue is in fact one that his aides are pointing to as part of the legacy years rather than lame duck years. That this is in fact, these last 2 years, he's getting some things done. And what they're also taking pride in is that this, to the Obama administration, is not just a victory on the Iran deal, but a victory of their philosophy in foreign policy. That is, that diplomacy first, that diplomacy can work even with governments you don't agree with, like Cuba and Iran. But that rather than going to war, the Obama presidency believes that this type of diplomacy is much more successful. And what's interesting, too, while it's very true that on the Hill there's going to be some problems here in Washington, D.C., that there is lots of objections, as John points out. But it's interesting, the polling in the country among people in the United States, just the average voter, shows that in the upper 50% in most cases do support an Iran deal because there are so few alternatives.
And John, Congress has an awful lot of time on their hands, 60 days. That's a long time for things to go either right or wrong, depending on where you stand. Why do they get the authority to review this deal in the first place?
Well, they passed a bill as this was going through. There was a big push in Congress to say whatever happens, Congress should have the right to ratify this agreement. They didn't get that. The compromise was to allow Congress to have a vote on whether or not to disapprove this bill. The interesting thing here is this means that Congress could vote overwhelmingly to reject this agreement. But the president has the ability to veto their rejection, and Congress would need to override the president's veto to actually kill this bill. That means he would need, the opponents of this would need a 2/3 majority to kill this agreement. 2/3 means you'd have to have a significant number of Democrats defecting from the president on his really landmark foreign policy achievement. I think that's highly unlikely. I think you'll see a big no vote in Congress on this, but it will fall short of the 2/3, and ultimately this agreement will be able to go into effect. But it'll be quite a statement. I mean, the president, as Jim points out, can point to polls that the public seems to be generally supportive of this agreement. But it's almost certain that as this goes through over the next 60 days of debate in Congress, that you will have a significant majority of the American people's representatives in Congress saying no to this deal.
And Jim, as John just told us, the president has veto power here, but certainly I'm sure he'd prefer not to use it. How much work ahead for the Obama administration in getting Congress to approve?
Well, I think what he's going to focus on, as John points out, is the Democrats, because while polls in general across the board do in fact support an Iran deal, polls among likely Republican primary voters are very much against the Iran deal. So it's unlikely that he's going to get many Republican votes in an election year for this Iran deal. So what the president has to focus on, as John points out, is getting Democrats to make sure they stick with the president in enough numbers to avoid that 2/3 majority. And as John points out, this is an important issue. Probably this and Cuba are the two most important foreign policy issues that the president has right now, and that are important to him. And he and his administration are going to be over at Congress, working the Democrats, having them to the White House over the next 60 days. A lot of things can happen in that period, but there's going to be a lot of pressure, especially on Democrats in the House.
And John, the president expected to address the nation directly on this issue. What does he hope to achieve?
Well, he's going to make the case that this is a landmark achievement for the United States. This will improve the national security of the United States by taking Iran further away from getting a nuclear weapon. And the big picture here is the president will say we had essentially two alternatives here. Either this agreement to get the Iranians to give up much of their nuclear capability, or at least put a lot of it on hold, or get on a path towards war with Iran. So the president will make the case when you have, a choice between an agreement that limits their nuclear capability or no agreement that leads us on a path towards another war in the Middle East. To the president, that's a pretty easy choice.
John Karl, thank you so much, and ABC's Jim Avila as well, reporting for us from Washington. And you can keep up with this story in real time by downloading the ABC News app and starring this story for exclusive updates on the go. I'm Ty Hernandez in New York.